All right, good evening. Time for us to begin our Bible class. Okay, well, John and I were talking. It has been a couple of weeks. I haven't been here on Wednesdays. I've been traveling. I feel like I've been here. And then when I started realizing, no, I haven't. I haven't been here for Wednesday night Bible class for a while. So it's good to be back on Wednesday nights. And so I hope as we continue this looking at different Bible characters. Could you turn this mic down a little bit, Suzanne? It's just a little bit almost echoey here. So if you'd like to go ahead and open up your Bibles to Genesis chapter 24, that's where we're going to be picking up on the story with Isaac. And I appreciate Gene taking care of the class and teaching it on. What's great is I get to watch them too, since they're live stream, so I get to watch what he was teaching and the next day while I was down in Texas. So, and I really do appreciate having that ability to have somebody teach and as well bring a different perspective as well, you know, when it comes to some of these Bible characters. And so when we look at Isaac, we know this is to me, he's a very critical part, of course, when we think about the transition between Abraham, Father Abraham. But then it's like this little story of a very important man, but he's overshadowed by the story of Jacob. And as we go through it, I mean, there's a lot of it there, but it's, you know, there's not the I guess you'd call it the nitty-gritty things of Isaac. There's something that just seems to be, there he is, and he gets married, and then he has, all of a sudden the focus comes on the children between Esau and Jacob. But, you know, we talk about some of the things, and just looking at his name, you know, we talk about his name alone, kind of is a reflection of the frustration that Abraham and Sarah went through when it came to having this child of promise, and over 20 years of waiting for this kid, you know, this child of promise to come. And then he does arrive, and then like we talked about last week, you know, the idea of him being then sacrificed, but just his name alone. Now, I think it's interesting because, you know, his name means to laugh. And there's two things that are interesting, because there's that laughter that they had when they were told, both actually Abraham and Sarah laughed. And I think it was kind of that nervous laugh, like, or that kind of, you know, okay, we've been waiting 20 years, you know, kind of, and then the angel calls her on the spot, says, why is she laughing? Oh, I didn't laugh. So there's that aspect to this name, Isaac, laugh. But then, now she kind of says in Genesis 21, 6 and 7, says, and Sarah said, God has made laughter for me. Everyone who hears will laugh over me. And she said, who would have said Abraham and Sarah would nurse children, yet I have borne him a son in his old age. So we'll give her credit, you know, that it was something joyful. And we think of this word laugh in our day today would be almost not necessarily of being astounded with joy, be joyful. You know, that people would look at them and be joyful. You know, when somebody's laughing at you because you had a kid, that doesn't have the same ring, does it, for us today? And good to see you guys. Sorry, I do have the text, the chat up, so if you want to engage in that. I see the Hayneses, you guys joined us this evening, so I'm glad that you're with us tonight. So I hope everybody that's out there that's joining us live, that you will jump on and contribute some thoughts about the character of Isaac. And anything you have to say, you know, we'll discuss. Unless it's way out of bounds, then no, we won't. But coming back to this, let's just talk about, you know, Isaac, just some kind of refresher, some aspects that I thought were interesting. The idea that he's the 11th generation from Noah. So he's, you know, 11 generations is a lot, but when you start thinking about how close it was, and then you think of Abraham and going back, he descended from the son of Shem. His father, of course, Abraham, he had this half-brother Ishmael, which is going to play a massive role in the history between the children of Israel all the way to this day. We know that the 12 princes that end up coming from Ishmael grow into the Arabic states that we see today, and still affecting that relationship. But God fulfilled his promise, didn't he, when he he said that they would be blessed, and they were blessed, and they did become fathers, descendants of Ishmael, of many nations. So we do see that. We kind of look at where he lived and everything. I'm kind of giving kind of a big picture of him, and then we're going to come back and we'll start looking in Genesis 24. But when we look at where he lived, well, he lived in the region of Canaan. He was nomadic. Some, I guess you'd call possibly by modern terms a Bedouin, which were nomadic people who traveled around and had no real possession of land. The only land that you could say, can you think about it, that he did own, he would own because he inherited his father's, Abraham's inheritance, would be a grave. That's the only land that they ever owned while he was alive and would ever own. But the promise is to that physical land that he's living on and dwelling on, which I think when we look in Genesis 24, we come around to the story we're going to talk about, Isaac and Rebekah. I think that's why Abraham has some issues with him going and leaving the area. So the control of that time, though, was by the Canaanites and the Philistines, I guess you would say, at that time. And there's a lot of stories in there that we see. And, of course, the events around his birth we already talked about, so I'm not going to dwell a lot on that. But there are some amazing similarities when we think about the shadowings and such between when we look at Jesus and we look at Isaac. It really is amazing how many things that are connected to each other and helping to show us again, because just again, when you know those shadows were things in which we could go back and look, and I think are exciting because we can now see these amazing connections to historical events that occurred thousands of years before the actual event that God wanted to show us occur. And so now we are blessed to be able to go back and say, look at Jesus and then look at Isaac. And it was a teaching moment as well. But one, we see that it was a miraculous birth. Both of them, in a sense. You have two, parents that were basically physically, as Abraham himself says, our biological bodies are dead. We cannot produce life, yet they were able to produce life. So, and then the waiting, and so there's a lot of things that we look at that I think are important. Also, the fact of the resurrection. There's an aspect of resurrection from the dead. And when you think of Isaac's sacrifice, which that's what last week looking at that whole event. One, and I heard this when I was reading this yesterday when I was studying and talking about the fact that they both carried their own wood, their own sacrificial wood. Jesus carried a cross. Isaac carried the wood, remember, up for the sacrifice. The very thing in which they both, so there's one that's I hadn't seen before. And in the sense that, Abraham had followed all the way through. I mean, he was raised up the knife and was committed emotionally, physically, to killing him and had a commitment. So in the mind of Abraham, Isaac was dead. But Isaac also, we know that, Abraham knew that the Lord was going to have to raise him from the dead to fulfill the promise, which is also the same thing that God had promised Israel, was that even though the death, and these are all through the prophets, that this Messiah, this king that was coming, was going to be, basically tortured, rejected, and die and rise again in the same way. They understood that had to be a fulfillment for it. I think when we kind of look at his upbringing, I think, let me see, I think it seems to be a little messed up here. I think a lot of his tutoring would have been did it completely blow out? It did, didn't it? Completely crashed. We look at his training and how were children trained in that day and age. Well, they followed the father around. They learned a lot about the father, which when I think about that, what were the stories and the things that, as Abraham would teach this young man about would be all the promises, his experiences, historical, your parents, our parents, they kind of teach us these things. And then when we get to some of the weaknesses, talk about it, that he then turned around and repeated some of the very things that his father did, that his father shouldn't have done. So it's kind of a pattern that we see that the Father had as well. But let me get caught up here for everybody. I don't know if it's going to, on the slides for everybody there online. And like I said, his place in history is a lock. There's no way around it. But if you look at Joseph, you look at Jacob, we have so much more detail about them. But you look at Isaac. Isaac was the first generation after the direct promise and the covenant established with Abraham. And there just seems to be this, I don't know, I don't want to say superficial, but again, compared to all that we have with the drama around Jacob, Isaac, we just kind of move over and we get right on into it. And so he is an important point in history that we need to look at. So let's go over to Genesis chapter 24 and look at the transition. Now we know at this point Sarah has passed, and with her passing, Isaac, of course, goes into grieving, and Abraham, as the very first verse, describes that he is old, advanced in years. And we don't know how soon after this does he pass, but we know he dies at 127, so he's well over 100 years of age. And so, but you notice it says, and the Lord had blessed Abraham in all things. God had fulfilled everything that he was going to give to Abraham. And now Isaac is, they believe, close to 40s. And he hasn't been married. Now, if you're going to fulfill this promise, the promise, yes, okay, I got my son, but that means now we need to get some grandkids. It's time to move on and get some grandkids. So he brings in his servant, his oldest of his household. And I read a lot about some people believing that this was the servant, his relative from Damascus, this one that he first said was going to be the one that Abraham thought would inherit. And God said, no, it's not him, Eleazar from Damascus. But I don't think that's something that I could really hold to and say, yes, I know for sure. All we know is it's just described as he is the oldest servant of his household. So he is one that is very trusted by Abraham, and he has him take this oath, which is really weird, isn't it? You know, it says, put your hand under my thigh. You can't get much more personal in that contact. I mean, today, we would shake hands. There would be some other way that we would say, you know, let's shake on this. That you would show that I am going to commit myself to this promise. So I think it's an interesting custom that they had, was to put the hand under the thigh and basically hold it there while you go through fulfilling or describing this promise. He says, you know, he said, that I make you swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and of God of earth, that you not take a wife for my son from the daughters of the Canaanites among whom I dwell, but go to the country, to my country, and to my kindred, and take a wife for my son Isaac. So anything interesting about this? You see that he's directing him to go back home, go back to where his family's from to obtain a wife. So why would he do that? What's wrong with the local women? They're pagan. They're also
they're idol worshipers.
They're idol worshipers. That we see this same thought even in Mosaic law, that they were children of Israel were directed not to marry nations around them, the women, because of the pagan religion, idol worship, they would then have that influence on the nation. So it's kind of interesting how this is almost a shadow of Mosaic law, that, here he is saying, I want a wife that is going to be from my descendants. Now, if you recall, when we looked at Abraham, where he came out of, there was pagan worship back home. But as we come back, we're going to see some interactions with the family that it seems like they're not pagan worshipers, that the family in which the servant ends up going to, there's a lot of Yahweh, in other words, that they're focused. Whereas before, we know that like his grandfather was probably in pagan worship. A lot of the Bible scholars believe that, Abraham's family, a lot of them were worshiping pagan idolaters. But yet we see that the family that he ends up sending the servant and arrives at is not. So, but that's one of the things but he doesn't want him to take his son, does he? He says, but, and the question from the servant in 5 is, he said, the servant said to him, perhaps a woman will not be willing to follow me to this land. Then I must take your son back to the land from which you came. And Abraham said, see to it that you do not take my son back there. Now this is interesting. Now 7, this is where, what does this have to do with him not going back? This is why I thought, the Lord, the God of heaven, who took me from my father's house and from the land of my kindred, and who spoke to me and swore to me, to your offspring I will give this land. He will send his angel before you, and he shall take a wife for my son from there. He brings up a part of the answer to why can't I bring your son, was he reminds him, I was brought out of that land. And I was brought into this land, and God said, this land is yours. So at first doesn't it seem a little random that he just brings up this part, and then he says, but go, God will take care of it. But why didn't he just say that? Why didn't he just say, there's a part where he could have just said, don't worry about it, an angel's going to guide you, and he'll get my son a wife. And I think it has to do with the fact that he doesn't want him going back because he needs to be there. There's something about it. Now, I heard, one I read about was talking about this idea of he can't leave the land because that was his. Isaac, in a sense, is one of the royalty of the future rulers of this land, which I don't buy that. I almost see it as a fear to send him back. He needs to stay. And there's a part where the possible re-entanglement of if Isaac was to go back home. I'm not sure, but he does seem to link this to why he doesn't want him to go, to this idea that this is his land.
Well, and also, he's getting so old that he didn't know when he was going to die, and it could be near his death. So he wanted his son there.
The continuation, exactly. He may not live, through it. But this land was to be passed on to Isaac. And again, there's no physical real estate that they have. So it's kind of an interesting vision in the way that Abraham sees this, and having the ability spiritually to know and have faith that this is God's people's land. And I was brought out of there, and my son is going to stay here as well. So Eileen says Abraham's brother Nahor's family would have also been descended from Shem, the Canaanite. Hittites were descendants of Ham, who were cursed by Noah, perhaps a more serious form of idolatry. That is really good. It also would make sure that they would have no intermingling between the descendants of Noah because of Ham's curse. Remember that? And they're the Canaanites. So that is a really great point of going back. So it's not only just the idolatry, but the idea that this genealogy cannot mix. To bring the descendants of Ham, who's been cursed because of his transgression against his father Noah, that it had to stay within the descendants of Shem, which I think is very appropriate. And I think that this is a reminder as well to the servant that about this promise, that this covenant that he has with them, And the idea that God is going to help guide him, that's one of the things he tells him. He says that he's going to, he said, you know, that woman is going to, you're going to be guided by this. But then he gives him an out in verse 8. He says, but if the woman is not willing to follow you, then you're free from this oath of mine. Only you must not take my son back there. So I think, sometimes we miss some of the simpler little points of faith. And this, I think, is one for Abraham, having this faith and knowing that God is going to solve this issue. God is going to deliver the wife. You notice he has faith, and don't worry, the Lord is going to do this. But if it doesn't, you're free. But Abraham knows. I believe he's very confident in God in bringing him back a wife. And so he makes this oath. Now, when he departs in verse 10, talking about taking 10 camels, choice gifts, and then when he departs, now this is about 900 miles journey. If you're traveling around 20 miles a day average, like I know that a lot of caravans, and that depends if you have a good day of travel, 20 miles is pretty decent. That makes it about a 45-day trip. So I just want to re-emphasize, I think, the idea of how travel was very hard. This was not going to be just a trip down to El Paso or somewhere real quick in order to get down there. And he's taking basically, I think, what we would call today a dowry. You know, gifts, these 10 mules and all mules, I'm sorry. Did I say mules a while ago? Okay, I thought camels. So he made his way to Nahor, which is probably the same name for Ur in Chaldean, where he came from. And the camels kneel outside the city of the well of the water at the time of evening, and the time the women go out to draw water. And he prays. So this we see that this servant of Abraham also has a faith and has, a faith in God. And he prays. He says, "O Lord, God of my master Abraham, please grant me success today and show steadfast love to my master Abraham." What a beautiful prayer, opening prayer. What loyalty and dedication that this servant has to Abraham. And then he says, "Behold, I am standing by the spring water. The daughters of the men in the city are coming out to draw water. Let the young woman to whom I shall say, please set down your jar that I may drink, and who shall say, drink, and I will water your camels. Let her be the one to whom you have appointed for your servant Isaac. By this I shall know that you have shown steadfast love to my master." Before he even finished, though, look at that. So he's still praying, and God's already working. This is something I thought was awesome. God's already, he's ahead of us. That's what I'm seeing in this, is that, a lot of times, we're praying for things, and then it's like, okay, now we wait for him to start working on it. And here, God started working on this probably when Abraham made a decision that he needed to send somebody to get his son a wife. May have even helped to inspire Abraham to saying, Abraham, you need to go and get him. I'm not saying verbally spoke to him, but somehow, this needs to start to take effect. But he already, before he finished speaking, Rebekah, who was born to Bethuel, the son of Malchah, and the wife of Nahor, Abraham's brother, came out with her water jar on her shoulder, and the woman was very attractive in appearance, a maiden to whom no man had known. She went down to the spring and filled her jar and came up. Then the servant ran to meet her and said, "Please give me a little water to drink from your jar." She said, "Drink, my lord." And she quickly let down her jar upon her hand and gave him a drink. When she had finished giving him a drink, she said, "I will draw water for your camels also, until they have finished drinking." So she quickly emptied her jar into the trough, and she ran to the well to draw water, and she drew water for all the camels. 10 camels. So this wasn't just You know, and you think about thirsty animals, that's one of the points of travel, kind of like in our cars. You know, we run so far, and when our vehicles are out of fuel, what do? We stop at a station, and we need. So what I'm saying is these camels are probably thirsty. 10 camels? So the very first encounter is already being set up, and she has said exactly what he was looking for. And so the man gazed in silence. Notice I think there's an amazement that he just finished a prayer. And now he's sitting there, and he's seeing all this unfold right before. So gaze at her in silence to learn whether the Lord had prospered his journey or not. So after she waters them, he then gives her a gold ring, which is pretty weighty. It says half a shekel, and 2 bracelets for her arms weighing 10 gold shekels. And then it says, please tell me whose daughter you are. Is there room in your father's house for us to spend the night? So he still doesn't know, is she of the family, the descendant in which he should be getting the wife from or not? But he still rewards her for what she has done in helping him in watering the camels and everything. And then it just opens up even more. You talk about the way God is working. You know, and she said to him, I'm the daughter of Bethuel, son of Milcah, whom she bore to Nahor. We had plenty of room, both straw and fodder, and room to spend the night. And the man bowed his head and he worshiped the Lord. And he said, blessed be the Lord, the God of my master Abraham, who has not forsaken his steadfast love and his faithfulness towards my master. As for me, the Lord has led me in the way to this house of my master's kinsman. You know, a lot of times we're really, really good about asking God, praying. How good are we about immediately identifying when God has blessed us and thanking him? So she heads to the house. I'm kind of scanning down a little further, but we run into Laban, Rebekah's brother, and he comes out. And this is where we look at some of these interactions, we can tell that this is not an idolatrous family. This is a family that is worshiping God. And as soon as he comes out, he ran out toward the spring. As soon as he saw the ring and the bracelets on his sister's arm and heard the words of Rebekah, his sister, thus the man spoke to me. He went to the man, and behold, he was standing by the camels at the spring. And he said, come in, O blessed of the Lord. Why do you stand outside? For I have prepared the house and a place for your camels. This is the way that God, and nothing ever said to this man, this servant of Abraham's, that somehow God spoke to him directly to tell him everything that was happening, that what God was actually doing. And look at the way that this man, being a faithful man, was able to identify that he was being taken care of. All these things were coming together exactly the way that the Lord and his master. And again, he then praises God, doesn't he? And you see there's Laban saying, "O blessed of the Lord." So he's already he's being taken care of, the servant. And so food is set before, they have this, and then, so he then identifies himself. But 33, before they feed him, he is so driven towards wanting to, complete his task. He says, then the food was set before him to eat, but he said, I will not eat until I have said what I have to say. And he said, speak on. So he said, I am Abraham's servant. The Lord has greatly blessed my master, and he has become great. He has given him flocks and herds and silver and gold, male servants, female servants, camels, donkeys. And Sarah, my master's wife, bore a son to my master when she was old, and to him he has given all that he has. So he gives him a history of all that, catching them up about who Abraham is. I'm sure that they were familiar with at least before he left. I don't know how much information ever traveled back after, they had left and Abraham had been in Canaan, but they definitely knew when he departed and where he was going, and I'll bet you that there's a part where he was telling him, the Lord has talked to me, and I'm leaving, and I'm going to a land of being blessed. And so you see the connection, this loop back, in other words, where his family was probably aware, again, that God had spoke to him and told him and directed him to leave and go to this place that he was going to promise him. And now they're receiving information back how God had fulfilled this promise to their relative. So, any thoughts or?
You can tell that that Laban is not a heathen. I mean, he's talking about God, he's talking about Yahweh, so it's nice to know that they're on the same page that way as far as worshiping God.
Yes. And I like I said, I think the way that the servant is being blessed and him being able to identify it and glorify God at the same time. So okay. I was trying to see if we had anything new on comments. So 50, Laban and Bethuel answered and said, the thing has come from the Lord. We cannot speak to you bad or good. Behold, Rebekah is before you. Take her and go. Let her be the wife of your master's son, as the Lord has spoken. They're pretty quick about that. But we find out that not as quick.
Yeah.
They then, and now, think about it. I mean, people who departed like that, you may never, the chances of you seeing them again alive, very slim to ever see. So it's interesting how quick they're able to say, this is God, and I want it to happen, and yes, take her, it's God's will. But then there's that reality that sets in, and a little bit like, well, wait, can we spend some time with her? Can we, and I think it's because of the love for her. And the realization that, wait a minute, we definitely dedicated her, we're agreeing, but there's a part where the reality is we're probably never going to see her again. And so then Abraham's servant, he heard the words, he bowed himself to the earth before the Lord. Do you see how much the servant is worshiping? I mean, that he is able to see God's hand working. I keep saying...
He's also able to fulfill his master's wish and the oath that he made to him, too.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah, and that's another thing. His loyalty and love, his own love for the master was being fulfilled. And I think that meant as much. And then the fact that God he's seen it. This is where you have faith comes by hearing God's word. Faith of this man, the servant, was not only from hearing what God had spoke to Abraham, but what Abraham now was telling him. And he had to have faith in Abraham that this was going to be taken care of. And now he's seeing it being fulfilled. But there's a hesitant, isn't there, in 55. Her brother and her mother said, let the young woman remain with us a while, at least 10 days. After that, she may go. But he said to them, do not delay me, since the Lord has prospered my way. Send me away that I may go to my master. Think about the journey again. 45 days. And that's, in other words, if you could actually move 20 miles a day, which would be a hard walk, based on terrain, it could take longer. So you're looking at a month and a half possibly of just returning back. His urgency also might have been the fact of Abraham's age. Knowing his master was growing older and he wanted to get back and show, that he had fulfilled this so that Abraham could be blessed by knowing what was going on. And so they kind of put it back on Rebekah, don't they? They say, let us call the young woman and ask her. And they called Rebekah and they said to her, will you go with this man? And she said, I will go. do you know who this guy really is? You know, I thought about that too. Could this guy just be some scam artist that rolled into town with a bunch of camels? He's a rich man.
And she hadn't even seen her to-be husband. She hadn't even seen her fiance.
So can we see something about her to this point as well, about Rebekah? Going back to the first encounter, let's slow down, slow our roll, and let's talk about Rebekah. You know, the very first thing we find her coming out and just automatically, naturally having this hospitality, this graciousness. That was far more important, the servant was watching, than to do with her beauty. He's not looking for just a beautiful woman. What he saw, that honestly, yes, she's described as being beautiful. She's described as being a virgin. But this man, you see, is watching her and seeing, and it's the action of her spirit that he's witnessing. And then I think that this is also coming here to this moment, her faith. Think about it. You know, I mean, we talk about Abraham and God speaking to Abraham and saying, pick up, and Sarah, and him telling Sarah, hey, guess what? You know, we're going to take a 900-mile journey off somewhere. I don't know where we're going. When we talk about their faith, I think we see this in Rebekah and saying, look at her faith that she's having in trusting. She's putting her life in this man's hand. Any thoughts? So they blessed Rebekah and they said to her, our sister, you may become 1,000 of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gates of those who hate him. That's interesting, isn't it?
Mm-hmm.
Of all the things that you would tell somebody that's leaving on the way out. So let's read that again. Our sister, may you become thousands of 10,000s, and may your offspring possess the gate of those who hate him. So here we almost see the family blessing Rebekah with the very covenant blessings that God had given Abraham, which was being passed on to Isaac. And they are, I don't know how much they know of the covenant and everything that's happening with Abraham, but they are basically showing us, and maybe this is some way of, the Spirit revealing, but this is the generations that would come from them, the 10,000s of 10,000s of her offspring that would come through them. And then, what is the gate of those who hate him? What does it mean by that? The gate of those who hate him. It is kind of interesting. It means something. What's the gate? What happened at city gates?
The elders met there. You come in or not, or you discuss the date, whatever needs to be discussed, and it will be upheld by those elders. What they say goes.
So when you say you're going to possess the gate, you're possessing the power. You're taking over. Not just burn the city down and take over the real estate. She's talking about a power transition to where her descendants would be the ones taking the power of those cities of the people who hate them. And do you think you see anything here? What happened when Joshua, you remember the cities weren't burnt down, were they? The city gates, except for Ai, right? In Jericho, I guess those gates kind of collapsed. But God even said, you're going to go into a land and dispossess these people. And they're going to come in, and you're basically, in a way, you're going to take over the city gates. You're going to be the power. I think for so long, I just, like I do a lot of times, you just read through something, you skip over it. But when I was reading that today, it just hit me how close that here's the family reinforcing this blessing upon her, the role that she's going to partake in. Continuing on. And then Rebekah and her young women arose and rode on the camels and followed the man. So she's not going by herself either, see?
Well, her nursemaid's coming with her.
Yeah. So that makes sense. And I think that if I was the servant of Abraham, I would want somebody to help her and be with her to help, because this is going to be a harsh trip, and then the transition that she's going to go through. So, so now we switch now the union when they come together. Oh, we got about 5 minutes. I think we can go. I keep forgetting we need to remember to stop at a quarter till. So now Isaac had returned, and he's dwelling in Negeb, which is a desert area in the south. And Isaac went out and to meditate in the field toward the evening. And he lifted up his eyes, and he saw, and he behold, and there were camels coming. And Rebekah lifted up her eyes, and when she saw Isaac, she dismounted from the camel, and then she said to the servant, "Who is that man walking in the field to meet us?" And the servant said, "It is my master." So she took her veil, and she covered herself. So, accident? That Isaac happened to be there meditating that time of the day. I mean, today we have, like when I was traveling last week, I sit there and could put it into my little Google Maps, and I knew that at 2:35 I would be back in Las Cruces, and I could sit and tell Suzanne when I left and said I'll be home at this time, and so she knew, and that thing's pretty accurate. And it did. When I got home, I was at that time. No. There's no way that they could. No, I don't know. Maybe they could send a messenger ahead and say, possibly, I guess I shouldn't just rule that out. But the timing, and it doesn't say that he went out to greet them. He went out to meditate. That, to me, I would love to know more. Isaac went out to meditate. What do I think of prayer. I think of, a lot of things, focusing himself. I don't know. But the timing is when she gets off, then she turns to the servant and says, who is this guy? Because he got up and he started to greet them. That doesn't say anything about how they were going to, who they were, but this man is coming to greet. And he says, no, that is my master. And so Isaac brought her into the tent of Sarah, the mother, and he took Rebekah, and she became his wife, and he loved her. So Isaac was comforted after his mother's death. So this is the part where we see, that there was this grieving process of missing his mother. And so, very simple. So what did it take to make a marriage? They just went into the tent and had relations. So that, a lot of times I get that question sometimes. Well, what did they do in the Old Testament? I go, you got to look at the cultural settings. I mean, what did they do? We'll see Jacob, what Jacob goes through, right? Whenever he does, and we're going to get to that, on him. And then here, we see that it was just a simple, intimate relationship and, engagement that they had, and they were married. So we're going to go and wrap it up there, and I hope you'll be back with us next week when we continue to look at Isaac. But it's going to end up transitioning, like I said, pretty quickly right over into Jacob and Esau. So before we finish, let's go ahead and let's have a prayer, and then we'll wrap up. Our most blessed Father, thank you ever so much for this time that we've had to be here tonight with one another. We pray that this lesson that we've learned in looking at the faith of the servant of Abraham and the people that were helping to fulfill your will, and the way that you continually show us through this written word how you are faithful, and that we should have that confidence in ourselves that today that your will is also being accomplished, and then as long as we are faithful to you, that we can have confidence in that the blessings will continue to be bestowed upon us. And we hope that we would always look to you during this week to meditate upon your word, to pray, to draw closer to you, and hopefully, Father, we would honor you in our service this week. We ask all these things in Jesus Christ's name, amen. Well, God bless. We hope to see you Sunday morning, 9:45 for Bible study, 10:45 for worship, 4 p.m. in the afternoon Sunday for another lesson. And, of course, next week we hope to see you here at 6 p.m. So God bless.